For parents who've had, more than one kid, they've got two kids or three kids, I think that often is the question is, how come these children are so different when our parenting practices have been similar? And I think a lot of kind of what's out there right now is that if you're warm, if you're validating, if you don't express high frustration at your child, they're going to turn out great. These are the things that you have to do. Yet in your book, you really look at the fact that, as you said, those children, those siblings are coming in. You can give the percentages, but those siblings are coming in wired differently. And so those parenting practices shift. And really, in the end, it's the child's behavior that shapes the parenting rather than the other way around, which is what we've been led to believe.
Yes, absolutely. So, there's a lot in there that you were kind of unpacking. And one of the things is that, in my field, we jokingly say, everyone is an environmentalist until they have their second child. And then exactly that happens. You realize, wait, I'm doing the same things. Why is this one turning out so differently?
I love that.
That's when we have the wake-up call about these kiddos are all wired differently from the very beginning. But then, the other piece that you were talking about is that, and I find this to be one of the most interesting pieces to come out of child psychology as well, is that when you do longitudinal studies of children's behavior and parents' parenting practices, a lot of what we see is just a cross-sectional snapshot. It's true of what we see out in the world, right? We see maybe the child who's throwing a huge fit at the grocery store and the parent who is, using some of these calming, warm strategies. And you might have some of these kind of what we might call old school, my parents' generation, who say oh, permissive parenting. They really need to crack down on that child, and that's why they are behaving in this way, right? Is that they don't have enough rules and boundaries. They're not getting in trouble. They should be. And if they did, they wouldn't throw those fits. Well, that's why we do longitudinal studies where we look at kids' behavior and parenting practices, and we follow it over time. And what we find is that, lots of parents, we all kind of start in the same place. We're trying to do all the things that you talked about, right? Which are so important, of course, in general, in parents being, warm and nurturing and providing appropriate boundaries, but also love to your child and all of that. But what we find is that over time, kids' behavior is more strongly related to future parenting than parenting is related to future child behavior. And that's because many of us start in the same place. And many of us might start from the place of, how hard can it be? Child misbehaves. There are consequences. They learn not to do it, right? If you implement consequences, it's going to shape future child behavior. But in fact, what we find is that kids who can be really challenging, what parents learn is they might have started by trying to implement consequences, right? They might have been the parent originally that in the grocery store was saying, stop that right now, or, you're going into timeout, or whatever it might be. But over time, they realize, actually, that's not effective. That's not working with this child. That actually the child's behavior is driving them to handle the situation in a different way because they've learned that actually that's better for the child. I mean, this is a good thing. We want to be responsive as parents to our children's needs. And we do a lot of this naturally. But there's often a lot of trial and error and banging our head against the wall, trying to figure out what's going on. And sometimes we will do things, especially with highly emotional kids who can be very challenging to parents, that make the situation worse before it gets better. And so I wrote this book with the idea that, knowledge is power. And I'm trying to get the research out to other parents who could use it, but also so that we can be proactive, right? So you can think about your child the way they're wired and implement things to help put in place strategies to avoid some of these challenges and to, kind of help them, be the best version of themselves, kind of actualize their natural strengths and gifts that they have.
Yeah, absolutely love it. And it's funny, as you're talking, again, to two kids here. One of them, we call them my awkward child. And with her parenting has to be very soft, very, very soft. She's very aware of any of my facial expressions. She wants to talk everything through at length with me when things go wrong. And then we have what we call our dandelion child, and that's little Maya. And with Maya, if you put in strict limits really quickly, she thrives. Nothing about so much about body language. The other one's all about the body language, whereas Maya does really well knowing exactly what's expected of her.
Yes, absolutely. And the interesting thing there is that, you're getting at the fact that actually it's not even just the way that we respond to our kids as parents, but we can be doing the exact same thing and our kids interpret it very differently. And this is, of course, related to the way their brains are wired. And, each of our kids has brains that are wired slightly differently, sometimes very differently. And I think for me, one of the biggest wake ups for that is that when my son was, probably around 8, 9, 10 or so, one of the child psychologists that I was working with, I find that other psychologists and psychiatrists are, we're the ones that are actually most, the quickest to seek help and work with other psychologists and psychiatrists because we realize we can all use extra help. And so they suggested, and I thought it was a brilliant idea. And I have a little bit about this in my book too, that sort of, the classic dimensions of kind of warmth and restrictiveness, where parents sort of fall on these parenting dimensions that you so frequently hear about. Are you kind of more of the authoritative parent, higher on warmth and higher on boundaries, or are you, essentially an authoritarian parent? So lots of rules, not a lot of warmth. Are you a parent who is low on warmth and, low on rules, the sort of neglectful parent? Or are you a parent who's high on warmth but low on rules, the kind of more permissive? You read a lot about those 4 parenting styles in the literature. And so, we sort of drew those quadrants out, and you plot where you imagine yourself as a parent falling. And then we actually plotted the other parent too, because, very often there's multiple adults in the child's life where the other parent, we saw the other parent falling. And then our child, my son, plotted, he saw each of us falling. And, we all did this independently, and then we lined them up. And, we all had very different perceptions of one another's parenting. And of course, the most important, perception in that, in many ways, is our child, because you might think of yourself as a very warm parent, but if your child doesn't perceive it that way, they're having a very different experience than maybe you're even intending. So I think this is why, we very often think it's natural human tendency. We only know the way our brains are wired, and we assume everybody else's brains are working exactly the same way. But this is kind of one of those exercises that, as your kids are a little older and you can start to have these conversations with them, can remind you that, the way that they perceive their environment is influenced by their own genetic dispositions.
Fascinating. And it makes so much sense as you say it. I'm like, yes, but it's so often forgotten about in the conversation.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, that's why I wrote this book. And I hope it's helpful for parents, is because we know these things on some level, right? We talked about even when you have a couple different kids, you sort of get like, oh, wow, these kids are really different. But usually and very often as parents, we're busy and we are just trying to make it through one day, one foot in front of the other. And so these things are not top of mind in a way that is intentional. That's thinking about like, how do we actually harness this knowledge, use this knowledge to make our day-to-day easier, our relationship with our children stronger, and smooth out some of those stressors and, day-to-day kind of battles, which are often resulting from these mismatches between our children's temperaments and the environments that we're providing, very often with the best of intentions, but that might not be a great fit for each of our particular children.
As we talk about that fit, the 3 E's, which I absolutely loved, which underlie each child's predisposition. Can we chat about those 3 E's?
Absolutely. So the 3 E's are something that I kind of use as a shorthand because I like things to be easy to remember, but they are basically grounded in a huge amount of literature. These are three big genetically influenced temperamental dimensions that show up in studies done of children all around the world. And they might be called slightly different things in the literature, but they basically come down to, the first is extraversion. So we all differ in how much we draw energy from being around other people, like being in big crowds, versus are more introverted. And as adults, we know this and we talk about this a lot. But sometimes we're not as intentional in thinking about it in our kids. And that can lead to some of these mismatches, which can cause a lot of family stress, which we could get into. The second one is emotionality. This is getting at the fact that some kids have natural tendencies toward, these bigger feelings. We sometimes now hear them called the highly sensitive child, or, these are kids who are quick to frustration, fear. They're often the kids that it feels like throw fits, quote unquote, over nothing or out of nowhere. They just have brains that are wired toward really fast and really strong emotions. And we know this can be one of the most challenging things for parents. And then the third one, the third E, is effortful control, or what we will sometimes call impulsivity or self-control colloquially. And that all kids get better on it as they grow up and their little brains develop, and you get more executive function, more prefrontal cortex, brain development going on. But unfortunately, that's not done until about age 25. And we also know that kids just vary in naturally where they're going to fall on that dimension. And so, kids who are higher on this might have more challenges with things like ADHD or behavior problems or kind of acting out or those sorts of things. And there are strategies to help kids learn about the good things that can be associated with being, a risk taker. There's good and there's not so good with all these different, ways that our brains can be wired, but while also kind of learning some strategies to manage the things that might lead them into problems.